Good morning. Today is the 27th of July, 2022, and I'm shooting on location with the West Point Center for Oral History in Falls Church, Virginia, and I'm here with Colonel Retired Ralph MASI, West Point class of 1977. How are you today, sir?
Thanks for having me, Dave, and for setting this up.
Sir, I'm so glad you're here with us. Could you please spell your last name for the transcriber?
MASI.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. When were you born?
Born August 5th, 1955, into an extended Italian-American family. Parents were first-generation American. Their parents all emigrated from Sicily in the 1890s, early 1900s. After World War II, my father joined the Foreign Service and asked for and received a posting to Palermo, Sicily, the ancestral homeland. And I was conceived and born in Palermo, and we returned to the United States in 1956. The ship that we were supposed to take back from Sicily to the mainland United States sunk. That was the Andrea Doria.
Holy cow.
So that was my first brush with very, very good fortune, and settled in New York, not far from the city where I had my upbringing.
Okay. So you were on the...
No, the ship that we were
supposed to be
take,
on.
Yeah,
holy cow.
went down.
Oh my goodness.
And so we boarded the SS Independence.
Okay.
And it was quite a homecoming when my dad, war hero, came back again, this time in 1956, and we have pictures on the New York docks at New York Harbor with everybody welcoming the family, he, my mother, my older brother,
okay,
and yours truly, who was, I guess, about 6 months old.
I was going to say,
point.
You were under one at
Yeah.
the time. Okay.
Right.
Now, you mentioned your father already. Tell me a little bit about what your parents did.
Well, my mother was a housewife, left school after the 8th grade in New York City, as so many did, and just either went to work or waited for her fella, began dating my dad when she was 16 in 1939. And he was at University of Pennsylvania at that time. World War II broke out. He withdrew from Penn, enlisted in the Marine Corps, and never went back to finish his degree. And they married in 1942 on the eve of his OCS. He had already enlisted, and he went to OCS, Officer Candidate School at Quantico, 1943. Classmates are Tyrone Power, Lee Marvin,
how about that,
and Sterling Hayden. They were all in his platoon, and he got to know them personally. And many years later, he'd have occasional contact with them in his subsequent line of work.
Wow, that's fabulous. Okay, but he went through OCS and received a commission?
Went through OCS and joined the 5th Marine Division initially, and was detached to the 27th Division Army at Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. Many years later, when I was stationed there, he showed me where he lived. Family quarters had been turned into a BOQ. And he was an L&O between the Marine Corps and the 27th Division Army for the Saipan invasion.
Okay.
And was on scene when Army Major General Ralph Smith, 27th Infantry Commander, was relieved for lack of aggressiveness by the Marine Corps General Holland M. Smith, for which Camp Smith is named, Howland Mad Smith.
Right.
And an enormous investigation followed. It cost Smith his 4th star, the Marine General. Ralph Smith was later vindicated, and my dad told me that it was one of the most embarrassing moments of his life when Ralph Smith, Army, was ordered off the island by sunset for what the Marines deemed a lack of aggressiveness during the Saipan invasion. Subsequent to Saipan, they redeployed to Hawaii. He was on the Big Island, training up for Iwo Jima, he returned to the 4th Division for the Iwo Jima invasion and was first wave ashore as an assault platoon leader February 19th, 1945. He never spoke of it until his 80s, and then only in metaphorical terms. I'd only heard about it from relatives, and as a young boy began to read of the great battles through history, from Hannibal and Caesar to Napoleon, to how the great captains, Lee, Grant, and others, would raise large armies, maneuver them, and fight them. And I grew fascinated with the study of the military art, but also small unit tactics too. So the seeds were planted for me at a very, very early stage.
Okay. Now you mentioned that your grandparents, they're the ones that immigrated from Italy?
All 4 of them did,
Okay.
from Sicily, near Palermo, between 1895 and 1902. And they worked as laborers in construction and fairly nondescript industries. And my own dad was the so-called prodigal son, the one who was first to college, joined the service. And photos that I have look like they're right out of the movies of him and my mother sitting at the Copacabana with entertainers around them right before he shipped off to the Pacific.
Okay, and his name was Vince,
Vince,
correct?
right.
Okay, all right. And do you know where your grandparents came into the United States? Is
New
this
York
the typical
Harbor.
Ellis Island?
Yeah, all 4 of them.
Okay.
I have their Ellis Island records and where they settled on the Lower East Side, and everybody knew everybody then. I have pictures of uncles of mine as a young men with Frank Sinatra and other notables. He was from Hoboken, but did a lot of his early club acts in the 1940s in Manhattan, 1930s.
Did your grandparents ever talk about what it was like coming over to the States?
Hard. It was very hard. Both the act of emigration itself, on those passenger liners, they did not look like what you see in the movies. They looked more like 4-masted schooners without the masts and the smokestacks, and they were all in steerage, and they left basically because it was a very hard scrabble living in Sicily, and there was no future there.
Okay.
But they loved their ties with the old country. So when my dad got his dream assignment to go to Italy as a consular officer in the U.S. Embassy, resettling refugees, that was what the position involved after World War II. It was a real thrill for the family to have its reconnection with its roots that way. And of course, the newest born. And I have my Italian birth certificate with the Italian first name, Raffaele.
Okay.
And I had dual citizenship until I was 21, and had to make clear all the paperwork when I applied for my nomination to West Point in New York.
Okay, excellent. Yes, sir. And you mentioned an older brother already. Is that your only sibling?
No, I have a younger sister too.
Okay.
We're a family of 5.
Okay. And what were your interests as a boy? You already mentioned reading history. What else were you interested in?
Baseball. I was a baseball fanatic, and I read a lot, and I studied a lot. My dad got me a TV in the 7th grade to put in my room to try to break my study habits, because I was not a quick study, so to speak, but I did well memorizing everything I could.
Okay.
So there was no time limit on my nightly study.
Sure.
Even in elementary school, sometimes I'd wind the clock till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
But I didn't have great reasoning skills. It didn't really develop well until much later in life. And whether the knack for memorizing became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy and further handicapped my thinking, I don't know, but I had a great knack for memorizing. It propelled me to the top of my high school class, or near the top. And then it all came crashing down at West Point, where you're with people who really know how to think, not necessarily what to think.
Wow. Yes,
My
sir.
dad, in fact, got me for a Christmas present one time something called The Memory Book, written by NBA Hall of Famer Jerry Lucas, who was also noted for his photographic memory. He'd memorize telephone books, and occasionally he'd be on late night talk shows, Johnny Carson, for example, and he was, in a sense, almost what you'd call nowadays autistic, because he could call out dates, names, and places, and my dad got a real kick out of that. And so he got me that book. Many years later, 1996, he said to me, Ralph, there's a new movie out, you gotta see it. And I was a new dad, brand new dad for the first time. Emily was 2 years old at that point. She's finishing medical school now. And I said, I don't have time to go to the movies nowadays, Dad. I was working 18 hours a day in the Pentagon too. I said, what's the name of the movie? He said, your brother and I said it's you. Forrest Gump is the name of the movie. I said, all right, Dad, I'll try to see it. When I saw it, I was really humored by his analogy there. But as a kid, I had a bit of a reputation for not thinking as fast as a lot of other people did on my feet. Eventually, we overcame that. At least I like to think we did.
But 3 master's degrees and a PhD later?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
You know the bio. Good. Yeah. That helped. It helped.
Sir.
You know, you learn how to think besides what to think.
Yes, sir. How was high school for you?
Unremarkable. I played baseball. I played in the band. I was third trumpet. I was second string catcher. You know, always trying to play catch up. But the big break came when my best friend said to me, when we were talking about future plans in the 10th grade, after a trip to New York City for his birthday, we went to a Knicks game, that he was going to West Point. I said, oh, what's next? Do you want to be president of the United States? He said, no, I've got it pretty well figured out. And you can do that too, if you want. I said, I'm not in that league, not by a long shot. But I began to think about it that very night, Thanksgiving 1970, and I spent it at his house. What if? Because I'd spent, so much of my boyhood reading about the great captains and the great battles of World War II, and it was my first acquaintance with strategic failure. American wars are not lost on the battlefield. They're lost in a much larger strategic sense, and we've got a poor track record since World War II in that vein. But I would read a lot, study a lot, and the time came to actually cast my net. So I took the Service Academy entrance exam, and my dad said to me, don't even apply, you're not cut out for it. And there was a lot of love in our family, but he also, back to the Forrest Gump analogy, didn't want me to perhaps get in way over my head and make a lifelong mistake. And secondly, I remember my relatives saying, you got to have connections. We have no family connections. Whether that was ever true, I don't know. But history is replete with examples of senior generals who made their way into the appointment process by way of cultivating a congressman or a senator, from Stonewall Jackson's time all the way to Douglas MacArthur's time. I mean, influences were heavily cultivated. And so they said, no, you don't have a chance. And so I applied through my congressman and found out that I was an alternate in a pool of 10. The Academy would make a choice. And so I was very, very delighted to see that. And then in January 1973, my mother met me on the front doorstep waving something in her hand. Well, what had happened was, back in the fall, I'd been called to New York City for an interview with Senator Jacob Javits, himself a decorated World War II veteran. He was a national icon at that point, and interviewed at One World Trade Center. And back to the knack that I had, I was able to present myself even at that stage, I think, fairly well, which was a bit of a difference maker. My dad used to get a big kick out of it when I'd meet him at the door every night. I'm 3 or 4 years old, and I'd recite the evening news for him. And he'd laugh, and he'd give me a kiss, and I'd smell that cigarette smoke on him. But that was a highlight of my day, reeling off the news when Eisenhower was president. So when I sat down to interview with the senator, it was like putting on my socks, and it came very, very naturally. So now back to my mother meeting me on the front doorstep with the telegram as I got off the bus from high school. It was a sleety, rainy, cold day, and she said, "You got it." And I said, "Got what?" And I looked at the telegram, and it was from Senator Javits, and he said, "I've nominated you as my principal nominee for United States Military Academy." And a lot of fanfare followed that. We were called back to the World Trade Center. All of his nominees for the service academies were with him. It made the front page of the New York Times. We're all sitting around the conference table. And sitting next to me, my two alternates, one's now a brain surgeon and one was a former secretary of the Air Force. Both top of our West Point class, and yours truly about 100 from the bottom or something like that. So,
okay, so all
you never
three
know.
of you
all three of
got
us,
in.
you know, all three of us got in. They were the alternates, and they got in as well.
Did your friend from high school get
He
in
did too,
as well?
The other U.S. Senator, Jim Buckley, brother of William F. Buckley, the famous commentator, nominated him. So both of us from the same high school class got the principal nominees from our two U.S. senators.
Yes, sir.
And I'd see him marching into the mess hall every morning during beast barracks, and I'd say, "This isn't for me." I said, "This isn't working." And he'd say, "Don't quit."
So you were able to communicate then?
Somewhat, through the corners of our mouth. He was in 3rd New Cadet Company, and I was in 4th New Cadet Company.
Yes, sir. Your father was a Marine.
Right.
Was there ever any desire to go to the Naval Academy and try to become a Marine?
No, no, because I had read and studied so much that West Point was at the top of the list, but I dreamed of a commission into the Marine Corps, and I did the next best thing, which was the infantry, because at the time, you know, that was a program that was occasionally on, occasionally turned off to allow inter-service commissions, but that was a hoped-for outcome. In fact, I thought about being a Marine pilot, and it turned out to be an Army pilot.
Yes, sir. Okay, and we'll get to all that because that's exciting as well. Tell me about your West Point experiences. What is your most vivid memory of our day?
I assumed I set a new record for how quickly somebody was asked to go ahead and resign. That came within about 30 minutes when an upperclassman said to me that I was not made for this place, and he wanted me gone by sunset, just like Hal and Mad Smith wanted Ralph Smith off the island of Saipan by sunset. True story. I also remembered eating lunch twice. Well, I didn't eat it, but it was there because they forgot to check my card, and I went into the mess hall twice. But the most enduring memory is Colonel Hugh Robinson. Tall, hard, chiseled, African-American colonel at the time, commanded the 3rd Regiment, U.S. Corps Cadets. Back then they weren't regimental TAC officers, they were regimental commanders. Alexander Haig had been a regimental commander before he went to the Nixon White House and went from 1 star to 4 in 3 years. But that was a big thing, regimental commander, U.S. Corps Cadets. So Colonel Hugh Robinson paced the stage back and forth with his Corps Fam heels, the heels clicking, and he said, "Gentlemen, look to your left and look to your right. Do it." He said, "One of the 3 of you won't be here 4 years from now." And that was, you know, quite a shock to the system. It turned out 4 years later that 2 out of every 4 of us would not be there.
Right.
But that the 724 that graduated with the class of 77 were some of the most outstanding officers collectively that I'd ever seen in 25 years.
Okay, excellent. How was Beast Summer for you?
Very tough. Very, very tough. I was a classic tie-up. I didn't get anything right the first time. And I had squad mates in 4th New Cadet Company that helped a lot. We worked with each other a lot, and anybody that can do anything for anybody at that time did so. But I found it really, really tough. And after about 2 weeks, I saw the light of day, because what saved me was my competitive advantage. We got into the memorization phase, and I began reeling off, reams and reams of data. Just like in Ranger School, I wrote every paragraph 3 in most op orders for 2 months. That's all I had to do, because I had them all spec'd. So no matter where we were, where we did, people would say, leave MASI alone, let him get 10 minutes sleep, because we're going to change patrol leaders, he's got to do another op order. But I had it all in my head. And back to Beast Barracks, the memorization saved me. And I went from, worst in breed to best plebe after about 4 weeks. But eventually, water seeks its own level.
Yes, sir.
And that was just a flash in the pan, because my knack for memorizing, came back to help me.
Yes, sir.
A great deal.
Of all the things that we have to memorize during Beast, things like Schofield's definition of discipline, Worth's battalion orders, definition of leather, MacArthur's opinion on athletics, which one was most important to you?
I think the one that stuck with me more than any, and it disappointed me when it changed, was the mission. The mission of the United States Military Academy is to instruct and train the Corps of Cadets so that every graduate will have the qualities and attributes essential to his progressive and continuing development throughout a career as an officer of the regular Army. And my greatest, I don't know if I'd call it fear, but preoccupation was somehow shortfalling what was expected of me, not only at West Point, but on active duty. Perhaps fail in a promotion, perhaps just leaving and in a fit of pique, which I nearly did several times, but I kept coming back to that. And once something is sort of etched in my conscience, it's very difficult to change that. Somebody once said to me, there aren't too many shades of gray, and you're thinking it is or it isn't. It's left or right. Speaking of which, I have a scar on my right hand, which for many years till I took driver's ed, I relied on to tell right from left. And my father would occasionally slap my hand when he'd say, look to your right, and I'd have to look at my hand first. It was a crutch. Right. Like so many other things in the makeup, I suppose. And eventually I disabused myself of those kinds of things. But once something like the mission of the military academy was etched in my conscience, it became very difficult for me to let go of that. And the mission changed when circumstances changed, and retention rates didn't really coincide with having that kind of going in premise throughout a career as an officer of the regular Army.
Yes, sir. Okay. All right. How was your next summer, the summer at Buckner?
Summer at Buckner, pretty unremarkable. I liked it, enjoyed friendships, many of which endure today. We just voted our 50th class gift, and I was the proponent for it, the lead for it. And I made probably 40 or 50 enduring friends at Camp Buckner that to this day, stay in touch, reflecting on memories and fast forwarding to the class gift and so forth. It was nice to be out from under the weight of plebe year. We had sit-up meals all the way till June. There was no falling out, and we lost 10 football games our plebe year. We went 0-10. So there were a lot of lows, and I struggled academically. I was a straight C student, pulled out several C's by the skin of my teeth. And I didn't make it out of 4 figures until 1976. a year before graduation. When incidentally our class was down to a very small number, I still have my grade printout from the end of spring term 1976, and we were down to 850 of the 724 that would graduate, and 150 of course dropped out with the electrical engineering incident in spring 1976. But that was my first time out of 4 figures. Well, the class was down to 3 figures, so if you do the arithmetic, chances are if you're still there, you're going to be in 3 figures. So I think I was like 700 out of 850 or something like that at that point.
Yes, sir. Okay. Now, you've already mentioned that you struggled academically. What were your favorite classes or least favorite classes?
Least favorite classes were anything to do with math. And the good Lord has a sense of humor, so I go to grad school in operations research and then did my doctorate in the management science. Something changed, and I'll be able to get to that for you in a moment. But at the time, having spent high school memorizing whole classes of problems in algebra, geometry, and calculus, that didn't serve me well at West Point, where you had to reason. We got graded every day, 6 days a week in math back then. Plebe math was 7 credit hours, fall and spring, 6 days a week, daily grade. And then when we got to physics and so forth, and thermodynamics and mechanical engineering, I didn't do much better. Those were all straight C's, but I did exceptionally well in history and social sciences. And I validated 2 full years of language in Beast Barracks.
Wow.
I had 6 years of Spanish in high school. I was fluent at the time, and I could still pick it up pretty quickly if I had to travel or survive on the streets. But we took the validation exams for all the subjects, and I'm sure I wasn't close in any one of them. But I sailed through the Spanish exam, and it was a respite from Beast Barracks when they called me for subsequent iterations. And the final exam to determine if I'd go into advanced Spanish or validate it, God forbid, was a sit-down with the department head and 2 Latin American officers.
Okay.
And the whole interview was in Spanish.
Wow.
But it was about the culture and history of Latin America, a Q&A. Again, back to that memorizing skill. I was able to converse with them as though I belonged. So I validated 2 years of Spanish, didn't have to take any language there, and then took history as a plebe, did well, B plus, something like that, although we didn't have the plus minus then. And then my second year, I turned up my social sciences clock. So I took government, economics, and then began taking social sciences classes and advanced social sciences by our first class year. And I had a U.S. ambassador and a subsequent 3-star as professors. He went to the White House to join the Carter White House right during our term end exam. He actually left the classroom and got the summons, and he went from 1 to 3 in 2 years. Bill Odom was his name, Sovietologist, and I'd taken him in a number of classes over government and politics of the Soviet Union. So international affairs became a passion, and the mathematical sciences became a survival exercise for me. But later I'd sort of merge the two, perhaps, in subsequent career activities.
Yes, sir. Okay. How did you do militarily?
Unremarkably. I loved Ranger School. Our class graduated only 50% of what started. We had a lot of frostbite in the winter of '78 after infantry basic. My whole squad froze solid one morning on a 2.5-ton truck that ran out of gas. We weren't supposed to do any stream crossings, but the Ranger instructor, who was a poster boy for the Army and Ranger School, literally on a billboard outside of Fort Benning, said, instead of going another 5 kilometers downstream, we'll cross the stream here because the truck's on the other side. So we got onto the truck, soaking wet, January '78. Temperature was probably around freezing, maybe in the 20s. And the Fort Benning sergeant went to turn her over, and nothing happened. And 3 hours later, they found us frozen solid. Everybody had gotten frostbite. They fired the RI, nearly court-martialed him. And a number of folks got dropped from the program. And I had second-degree frostbite on my left foot, but endured it and went on sick call. And the physician assistant said, "You're a Ranger, I expect you to use your foot as a club. Use it as a weapon if you can't use it to walk on it." And so that brought me back to the mission statement, and things went really, really well. After that, I was the platoon leader for the whole Florida phase of Ranger School. And like I said, it was a matter of rote spec, a lot of it for me. I memorized every op order, scenario, reconnaissance, security, economy, a force, ambush, screen, reconnaissance, and so forth, and would write those and then turn it over to the rest of the patrol. I was at the top of the class, but I got a major spot report in Florida when a classmate had his M60 rusted shut.
Oh.
And they landed the spot report on me for failure to supervise. So that was a valuable lesson that I never forgot, making sure that every last detail is covered, which of course is emphasized in Ranger School, but that was an example that I never forgot. As a rifle platoon leader, Fort Hood, it fit me like a glove. It was doing what came naturally. And then the next big challenge was flight school. And that's where my ability to synthesize and integrate large volumes of disparate information came back to haunt me. And it wasn't a matter of memorizing anything except a particular emergency procedure maybe out of the manual, and we had to do many of those. But it was a matter of managing airspeed, altitude, engine instruments, a very angry instructor pilot, air traffic control, range control, formation flight frequencies, and so forth. And that was, I think, the first time where I had to manage large volumes of information coming at me. And I think between 1979 and 80, and then in my peak flying years, that ability was honed. I didn't have it at West Point. Like I said, the ability to reason through complicated problem sets was just not there. Did well in the social sciences and humanities, for example, but not in the hard sciences. It seems like that switch flipped. In flight school, I really struggled. It was like, Beast Barracks all over again. I was the butt of a lot of good-natured jokes. It was like, if MASI gets it, anybody can do it. I was the last in my flight school class to learn how to hover. The last to solo. I was so late in soloing, which is all merit-based, that they forgot to throw me in the pool, which was a tradition. And I felt kind of let down, like they completely forgot about me. But fast forward, and I was the first to make pilot in command as a first lieutenant, first to break 1,000 hours, and I flew probably 600 single pilot hours in Cobras in Hawaii, in Korea, with a crew chief in the front, unless we were armed. But occasionally we'd let them fly with us in gunnery too, if we had extra ammo to shoot. And nothing like endearing yourself to your troops, besides turning wrenches with them on the weekends, like having them fly and shoot from the front seat of the platform. So I think that was the big turning point, the flying career for me, and I absolutely loved it. And had 3 years in the 25th after 1st Cav Division, 2nd Armored Division in Germany, where I was a platoon leader in both places. My battalion out of Fort Hood deployed to Germany, and actually PCS there. I came back for flight school.
Okay. All right. Now, sir, to go back to West Point, how did you do physically at the academy?
Not well. no big surprises there. Straight C's in PE except for boxing. I got a B in boxing, and that was a source of great pride because one of my uncles was a Golden Glove boxer in New York City, and I boxed 2 years of intramurals. But straight C's in PE, and had to work extra hard. When people were asleep, I'd be out running in the afternoons. I had to watch my weight really carefully because I was a lifelong fatty. You know, born fat, stayed fat, and in a Sicilian family, you know, the calories can pile up fairly quickly. So I've been a fitness buff all my life just to keep pace.
Sure.
But eventually, you know, you build in competitive advantages that way too. And I think I was probably so fit in Ranger School that some of the super studs were not used to the, you know, the pain and the deprivation and the levels of exertion that it took in the cold and the wet and so forth. And we had a number of classmates that found it very, very difficult too.
Yes, sir.
But others who you'd have never figured did extremely, extremely well.
Okay, excellent. Now, you were involved in quite a few extracurricular activities as a cadet, including Catholic choir, FCA, OCF, Sunday school teacher, and even Behavioral Science Club. What stands out in your memory about some of those extracurricular activities?
They gave me moral strength. I used to go to daily mass at Holy Trinity Chapel, for example, and climb the hill at 10 to 6 in the morning, and then, you know, get into the mess hall right around the time the light came on to get a cup of coffee or a slice of toast. But most of these you probably surmise involved exercises in human affairs, faith building, and that was a great source of strength for me, still is, in fact, my faith.
Yes, sir.
And so that was a centerpiece of my extracurricular work. There wasn't much time in my schedule for too much else because I was a barracks guy. I had to write my papers on the weekend just to study for the C's that I'd get during the week.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I didn't go to hops. I didn't socialize a whole lot outside of the barracks.
Who were the priests at the time?
Father Curley
Okay.
was one of them, and Father McCormick was the senior chaplain. And that's interesting that you asked that because I'll spin off an anecdote for you. At the end of the first week of these barracks, I knew this was going to end in disaster, and I'm figuring what's even worse is that, you know, I'll let my extended family down. So many hopes were riding on this. You know, my uncles, my aunts were fascinated with the whole affair, and this was supposed to be a game changer. And the Sunday after our day, which would have been the 8th of July, 1973, we had no privileges, of course, at that point. It was time for, you know, equipment maintenance, cleaning rifles and things like that on a Sunday afternoon, commander's time, quote unquote. And you know, the yelling was constant, you know, and I stood out like a sore thumb as a guy who didn't get it right most of the time, even though I tried. It just wasn't coming to me. And I decided, against all seasoned and reasoned judgments, to just walk right out, which you couldn't do. And I traipsed my way up to the Catholic chapel on a Sunday afternoon, July the 8th, and I knocked on the door of the rectory. And I said to Father McCormick, I said, you introduced yourself to us last week. You know, I introduced myself to him. And I said, I wonder if we might, you know, just have a few minutes together. Maybe he thought I wanted to say confession for him or something like that. But he invited me into his office, and He said, so how can I help you? And I said, well, I'm failing at this. I'm pretty sure this is over. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know what to do. And he listened to my story, and I think he'd probably heard this kind of thing many times before, although not necessarily on a Sunday afternoon with a guy just walking there with the barracks on lockdown, and that was completely verboten. I mean, at that time, yeah, you couldn't just leave the barracks and go visit somebody in the quarters area. And he said to me, I think you're feeling sorry for yourself, and you need to go ahead and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, tell yourself you're going to do this, you're going to go ahead and make it here, and you're going to go ahead and make everybody proud. And that was my greatest fear. It was fear of failure, not only for myself, but for those that had their hopes pinned on me. And that was another one of those game-changing moments. The second week, I felt somehow refreshed because I realized that the problem was me. It was not necessarily even the chaos that was brought down upon me, but it was my reaction to it. Mm-hmm. And I learned then that so much of life is about how you react to circumstances that are thrown at you. And in my case, they should have been thrown at me because I was inept, in those first few days and weeks of Beast Barracks, where the intensity was absolutely unbelievable at the time. It really, really was. I remember when I had a chance to sit at one particular table in the third week of Beast, it was a breath of fresh air. This guy, I thought, is different from all the rest. And he smiled and he made small talk with the plebes, and it was Dave Petraeus. Quite a human touch. And I thought to myself, right in the moment, future 4-star. No, I didn't. But you could tell that this fellow had the knack, but not that many did. There was a lot of toxic management. I wouldn't even call it toxic leadership because there's no such thing. You can't be toxic and a leader at the same time. And I learned most of the leadership lessons I would impart through life by observing what didn't work. Fast forward to our class gift in the study of strategic failure and what gave rise to that gift. A lot of my time at West Point around hostile and negative circumstances told me what would work with people and what would not. That's why our superintendent, Sid Berry, was brought on by Creighton Abrams to instill a sense of positive leadership, and he made clear that was his mandate from the outset. And I got to know him personally near the end of his life, and we talked about that, and we'll get to that later in the interview, I'm sure.
Yes, sir. Okay, excellent. Now you were at West Point when Saigon fell
Right.
On April 30th, 1975, and I assume that probably 95% of your instructors were Vietnam veterans and things like that. What was the feeling around West Point when that event happened?
I didn't hear much from faculty, but certainly heard it in the ranks, in formations, among upperclassmen. I remember one very, very good and hard upperclassman who later became good friends with me when we were contemporaries on active duty many years later, talking very derisively about how this was expected and what a waste it had all been, and so on and so forth. But that was the chatter, that it was all in vain, and we should have expected it. Yes, and sir. Fast forward 50 years, and the same scenarios played out in Afghanistan.
Yes, sir. Okay. Tell me about your experiences. You mentioned it already with the honor incident that your class experienced. Tell me about your experiences with that.
Back to my greatest fears. And again, I'm hopefully not spending too much time on what's inside my makeup, but one of my greatest fears once we got the honor briefings, new cadet barracks, beast barracks, and so forth, was that I'd make a mistake, either fail to put my pencil down at cease work or inadvertently see somebody's paper and subconsciously, co-opt one of their answers as my own. And I had this bad vision of having to be picked up from the military academy and taken home after being found on an honor incident. So that became, I would call it a minor preoccupation of mine to live by that rule. And I respected it, and I believed very, very strongly that it set West Point apart. So in the spring of 1976, the first Monday after Easter Sunday, our break had just completed. Our regimental commander, Colonel Arv West, retired one-star, highly decorated during Tet, called me and a prior roommate, he was not my roommate at the time, Bill Ryan, to his office, midday. And I said, Bill, what's this about? He said, I have no idea. And we figured that, we had done something wrong. And Bill and I were very, very close friends. We'd go to Sunday Mass together. His father fought and wounded in the Bulge, like my dad did in the Pacific. And he was top of the class, I was bottom of the class. And we found a real kinship, and we remain very close to this day. He's one of those guys that did things right the first time, every time.
Sure.
And you're looking at the polar opposite of that. But we were best friends. Same as another good classmate, Bob Evans. Same mold. So Colonel West calls us up to his office, and we're just standing there at parade rest. Secretary had motioned us in, and he's on the telephone. And I remember his words to his contemporary. He chuckled, and he was in a good mood, and he said, yeah, I was just picked up for 06, below zone. All of his promotions were below zone to that point. And we got some things going on, so I'll get back to you, but thanks again. And he hung up the phone. And so he said to Bill and I, he said, something really bad is happening. And I know you both well enough to know that you're not involved, but you're going to be called to go ahead and address this in some form or another. And you are both choices of mine to help make this right. We didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And then he let on what had happened, that quite a number in the class of 77 had been determined to have collaborated on a minor take-home electrical engineering problem where a circuit was given, diagram had to be completed, values assigned, and so on and so forth. And it was determined that quite a number from 77 across the 4 regiments and across the 36 companies had received unauthorized assistance from classmates, from peers. And ironically, my company, which was B2, was not a collection of scholars. We had the last man in the class. We had very few people ever make a dean's list, maybe 2 or 3 historically, over 4 years, over the 3 years that we were together, even made the dean's list. We didn't have any starmen in B2. And there was a cluster from B2 in section 16, the bottom section of electrical engineering, called the ejection section. And our professor was Captain Billy Frazier, a rumpled, chain-smoking, earthy, career signal officer. And after the scandal had broken, one of our beloved classmates, Tim Flanagan, said to him, Captain Frazier, have you ever wondered why not a single guy in section 16 right here was called before the honor board, and he said, "This is the land beyond hope. All of you in section 16 are already condemned. So why would you risk your cadet careers on something like that?" He said with a laugh. Now, he was only half serious about that because we liked him and it was evidently mutual, but he happened to be the exam OIC for that take-home exercise. And every exam back then, maybe now still, has one single professor write the exam and then set out the standard for grading it. They call it the pony in war college education and so forth. And it was somewhat remarkable that not a single one in our section was called before an honor board, but it began with a few drips when Colonel West called us forward, and then it was like a pipe burst, and it was everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until summertime, when the numbers were so large that the honor committee gave way to officer boards, and I went to testify on behalf of several classmates in B2 who had been implicated, and I didn't believe they could have done anything wrong, and I'd have staked my life on it. But then I saw the papers laid side by side. Mm-hmm. The same errors carried forward from one to the next, the same numbers, the underlined twice in the same place. And it was determined that this was somewhat systematic within companies and cells in companies, not necessarily with any uniformity across the Corps of Cadets. But it wasn't until many years later, on a long car ride with our superintendent one-on-one, Sid Berry, that I learned that he had been brought to West Point by Creighton Abrams in 1974 to be the superintendent because of some problems with the honor system, as Barry put it to me. Mm-hmm. In 2004, I set up a class lunch at Fort McNair, Washington, D.C., at the behest of several classmates. And on a lark, I looked up Sid Berry. I knew he lived in Arlington, Virginia. Wouldn't have dared, tried to socialize with him. But I cold called him. And I said, I'm one of yours from class of 77. We're having a lunch. Would you care to join us? And in his very, very, staccato, measured tone, he said, absolutely, I would be delighted. So it turned into something of a farewell for him. Mm-hmm. We had several hundred pack the ballroom at Fort McNair. And so on the way to Fort McNair, he told me that story plus one other on how he learned that women were going to be admitted to the service academies. But he told me the story of how Abrams had tasked him with straightening out the honor system where there were some problems. We didn't know that at the time. Mm-hmm. Of course, nobody who did would have ever even dared breathe it. But if you turn the clock back to 1971, a superintendent was relieved and reduced in grade after lying about My Lai. And that seemed, in retrospect, to coincide with a post-Vietnam, you asked about Saigon and the reaction mm-hmm. to it, sense of malaise, an atmosphere of working against the system, perhaps. That superintendent was relieved. I'm not going to name him out of respect for the civil liberties of those living and deceased. But Major General Bill Knowlton was brought in to succeed him mm-hmm. in fall of '71. Now, Knowlton was a two-star on the Army staff. He was a director of the Army staff. That is not exactly a king-making billet. Never has been. Probably would have retired a 2 or 3 star, but was summarily reassigned to West Point as a 2-star. Many superintendents back then would be. Promotion didn't necessarily go with it, but would follow. And Knowlton got promoted to his 3rd star after he was superintendent, did well, got a 4th star, and in summer of '74, Sid Berry was brought in to succeed him. Now, Berry was class of 48. The youngest brigade commander in the Army, the youngest division commander in the Army, had just finished command of the 101st and was earmarked as a future Army Chief of Staff. Now, he never got the honor system under control, evidently. You know, the actions speak volumes for what happened. And of course, we didn't know what went on behind the scenes as he, tried to, make sense of whatever degradation the system had undergone. Mm-hmm. But he told me about that in the car, how that was one of his going in edicts. My first encounter with General Berry was 1976, after the honor scandal had broken into the open. And we were training the new class of 1980. We'll get to that later, I'm sure. And word went out that day to the new first-classmen, that was us, that General of the Army Omar Bradley was going to be visiting West Point as a guest of General Berry. Be respectful, give him space, don't approach them. And, they're going to be at quarters 1, the superintendent's quarters. I think that's quarters 1. Or is it 101?
100.
100. And so one evening I'm out with my roommate from academic year, taking a stroll on the apron. And so down Diagonal Walk, we see General Berry in dress whites pushing a wheelchair. And I thought, that's him. It's Bradley. And 2 women were with them. And they were taking a very, very leisurely sunset stroll. And I always loved walking around West Point at night. I'd even do that as a plebe at night, dreaming of where the Giants once stood. So this was no different. I was out after dinner, and they were coming back from the officers' club. And so I said to my roommate, let's go meet him. And he said, what are you, nuts? He said, we're going to get written up. We're going to get slugged. I said, when are you going to have a chance to do something like this again? So let's go. General Berry, many years later, remembered that to a T, because I made a beeline for the 2 of them. My roommate followed close behind and got within speaking distance, and I saluted and said, good evening, General Bradley. And the hand very, very slowly came up, and I could see those 5 stars on each shoulder. He was wearing his dress greens. Berry was in white. And saluted General Berry, and he threw his head back laughing. He was just elated and made small talk. And I remember his wife, Kitty Bradley, was with him, and she was beaming. Mm-hmm. And she was immaculate with a platinum hair, and she had a circlet of 5 stars around her neck. And from what I later read, she was not bashful about her association with the general. And met Mrs. Berry at the same time, and we talked for about 5 minutes or so. And so it was very, very jocular, very, very jovial. But back to that car ride, it was a very, very somber awakening for him, because his star fell as a direct consequence of that. Whether he'd have been an Army Chief of Staff or not, we don't know, but he went on to command 5th Corps in Germany, and they had nothing for him after that. And of course, there could have been something for him, but I believe, the spring 1976 incident followed. I was called a number of times to go down to sit interviews, New York Times and media outlets. I was no zealot, but I was a true believer in what the Honor Code stood for, and there were no shades of gray in my thinking. Maybe I impressed people that way. This guy is a left, right, there's no middle ground kind of a thing. And I wasn't overzealous about what might happen to those classmates either. I want to be clear on that. But at the same time, I mean, the standards were fairly clear, and talked about the virtue and the durability of the honor code, and that's something that carried forward in the class of '77 ethic. We graduated only 724 out of 1,400 that started. I think it was 1,396, but those 724 went on to very, very strong careers. We had 500 still on active duty at 10 years. Over 300 were promoted to major. Some left before the major's board. A couple of hundred made lieutenant colonel, 70 colonels, and 10 general officers. Service in a number of wars, a number of combat infantry badge awardees, and CEOs, COOs. And our class not only strengthened the cadet honor code and defended it, but made that successful transition to women at West Point happen. And in that same car ride, General Berry said, "I'll tell you about how I first learned of women at West Point." Well, it had been written into the 1976 National Defense Authorization Act to go into effect January '76. But he picked up Gerald Ford at Newburgh, then Army Airfield, actually Air Force Base, Stewart Newburgh, for the class of '75 graduation. And on that car ride, President Ford leaned over to him and whispered to him, so the driver didn't even hear, "You're going to have women at West Point starting next year, the summer of '76. This is '75's graduation day." And Berry said he was absolutely stunned. And of course, at his level, he knew that it was, NDAA material, Defense Authorization Act material, but like so many other things in it, you never know if it's really going to come to fruition. Is the mic okay?
Yes, sir.
Or if it's just, going to be subject for more debate, more discussion. And so the rest is history, and that was a good, successful transition, and that class turned out to be a good one as well. But
yes, sir.
We're all very, very proud of the class of '77, I think with very good reason. No classes after ours had retention rates onto active duty like '77 did. And West Point is not fond of comparing classes as retention and active duty goes, but I began to work the retention problem quite a bit as a lieutenant colonel and even as an 06 on active duty. And the precipitous declines in retention were noticeable, both in peacetime and in war. It wasn't strictly an artifact of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes, sir. Well, you mentioned the arrival of women at West Point and how General Berry heard about it. And you mentioned that your class trained the first class to have women in it. Tell me about the introduction of women to West Point.
There was quite a spin-up to it by way of preparation. And if I had to characterize it with a catchphrase, it would be a lot of it was made up as we went along. Guidance would come down from the TAC officer chain to the cadet companies. The emphasis was on positive leadership. That was Sid Berry's thing from the get-go as superintendent. And to my recollection, it was a very, very positive leadership exercise that summer. I don't think I can recall any corporate-wide bad experiences where something went off the rails. In contrast, say, to summer '73, the new cadets now, 1980, with a spotlight on them, got to eat during beast barracks. We did not. I mean, a typical weight loss was between 20 and 30 pounds because food deprivation was a norm, at least through the first few weeks of beast barracks. And once attrition was sufficiently high, it seemed like the portion sizes went up. We had the attrition model in place, even without the 1976 incident where 150 were either turned back or left altogether. Attrition was high going in. Like I said, before that happened, we were down to 850. Mm-hmm. That would have been the smallest graduating class since the Corps had been expanded percentage-wise, the class of 77. Before the electrical engineering issue, it would have been the smallest class percentage-wise, but it was a good class. I mean, what was left was strong.
Okay. All right. You mentioned that you branched infantry.
Right.
Later switched to aviation. Why? And you also mentioned why you picked infantry, because you didn't have the option of becoming a Marine.
Right. Right. Loved the infantry. Loved the small unit leadership. It fit me like a glove in all kinds of weather. I was single. You know, I had no other, you know, interests really besides what my men did and what we did. But from the time I first saw an AH-1 Cobra at Camp Buckner making a low pass, and one of my professors, Ted Sendock, got out of the cockpit. He was a Cobra pilot before he assumed his instructor duties. I wanted to be an infantry Cobra pilot.
Okay.
And I knew there was a lot of career risk to it, because even then folks said, you know, aviation's not a good career track. There was no aviation branch then.
Right.
But I wanted to be an infantry Cobra pilot. And so after my troop time at Fort Hood, I flew for 3 years in Hawaii, flew 700-800 hours there, a lot of it armed, a lot as pilot in command, a lot of in-flight emergencies. Probably a half a dozen, 3 that were serious, enough to call out the crash trucks while I was inbound. But I loved every minute. When I wasn't flying, I was thinking about flying. And I wasn't a natural, but I made myself.
Yes, sir.
A natural. But from there, I went to fly again at the 82nd. And the time was running out on being a company commander of anything. Mm-hmm. What happened was, when I was at Fort Bragg, the Army switched over from the old H-series TO&E, where majors commanded in aviation. I couldn't command in Hawaii. I was a platoon commander as a captain and as a first lieutenant. To the J-series TO&E, where captains were commanding aviation units. And all of a sudden, the 9-ship Cobra platoon that I had in Hawaii became an 8-aircraft attack helicopter company. But what happened was Fort Bragg, because of the readiness mission, had its timetable for conversion slipped. So majors were still commanding at the 82nd. And I couldn't get an aviation command. Flying Cobras in the 117th Cav. I was a platoon commander there. Mm-hmm. And after my first year, I went to be an assistant G3 under one of our old TAC officers, Joe Kinzer, later 3-star, was a G3 of the 82nd. And so I was the only assistant G3 as a captain. And I was also the division briefing officer. So I had to brief morning and night, field, garrison, and so forth off of cue cards. I had to give a scripted briefing, G1 through G4, what every brigade was doing because of the 82nd's profile. So I had a lot of extra duties in that capacity, and loved that leadership climate as well. And I learned some very, very powerful leadership lessons from Kinzer. I really did. But in that assignment, a future chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was commanding the 1st Brigade of the 82nd, Hugh Shelton, offered me command of his brigade anti-tank company, airborne infantry anti-tank company. As a bona fide aviator, with aviation branch having been formed at that time. And I called aviation branch and gave them the good news, and they said, you can't do it because you're an aviator now, you can't go command an infantry company. I said, well, I'm going to do it because I'm not going to command an aviation company here, and I'm probably not going to be a battalion commander because it'll either be an infantry command or no aviation command. But I'm not going to, spend my career without having been a CO, at least at the company/troop level. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, you're done. And it grew very profane. Assignment officer hung up the phone on me and said, "You're on your own now. So if you do this, you're finished. You might as well get out of the Army." And so I commanded my brigade anti-tank company, and I was a separate. And so that was a plum assignment. There were a lot of former infantry company commanders who wanted it because that was normally a second command for somebody who had already commanded a line company. But I'd shot a lot of anti-tank missiles from a Cobra. I knew anti-armor tactics. I nearly stayed behind at the advanced course to teach tactics.
Right.
It was a good match.
Yes,
and
sir.
so I had my separate company, and I would argue for and get permission to fight it as a maneuver unit. Normally my 3 platoons were assigned out to the 3 airborne infantry battalions of the 1st Brigade. But occasionally they'd let me leave it intact and fight it as a separate
Yes, sir.
anti-tank company with very good effect, National Training Center deployments and so forth.
So was this D Company?
No, it was called an E Company.
E Company.
Echo Company.
E Company of the 504th.
E Company 504.
Okay.
In fact, if you ever see James Gavin's On to Berlin, right on the cover of the book with Gavin's picture on there, you'll see a circle drawn around E504.
Okay.
That was one of the only company symbols on that map, and I thought that was quite an ironic historical coincidence. And I loved every minute of what I did. And I ended up having to retire the colors because as that conversion commenced to the J Series TO&E, the Echo companies were deactivated. So I was the last ever commander of
Okay.
E Company 504th, had a 14-month command, and then it was time to go ahead and make good on my promise to get out of the Army, made to my assignment officer. So I went to Washington, I interviewed on Capitol Hill for a low-level staff position, got one, and I was torn between commercial flying or going to work on Capitol Hill. And I went to see the assignment officer and I said, it's time to go. I said, I've got a position now on Capitol Hill. I've had my company command, and I've done everything I feel like I should have done, back to 1973. And he said, you can go to grad school now. You've had command. I said, but wait a minute, what about what you told me 12 months ago? He said, you've had command now. You can do anything that you want. And
So that changed the dynamic.
well, his first name was Mac. That's all I'll tell you.
Sure.
But his nickname was Lion Mac. And so the saying was, at personnel command or MilPersed, now PersCom, we don't lie, but the truth changes. And so all of a sudden, I was able to go ahead and write my own ticket. So I went to Texas A&M, where I met my wife, Denise, 1987, for a master's degree in operations research, industrial engineering. But now, all that math and management science came a whole lot easier. Back to my flying experience and what I accrued by way of being able to think critically and quickly across multiple information domains.
Okay.
Sometimes, with serious emergencies in progress too.
Okay. Now, hold on just 1 second, sir, so we can...
You find this interesting?
Yeah, it's fascinating. But this was your second master's, right?
I did one on my own
Okay.
while I was stationed in Hawaii on the flight line. I was bone tired, but I'd go to Hickam Air Force Base where the University of Oklahoma had an extension. And I did an MPA from 1981 to 83. It was a great program. It was books in a box. You write book reviews in advance of the class meeting, and then it met Monday to Friday, 6 to 10, all day Saturday, final exam on Sunday. And it was a rigorous distance education program. No computers, obviously, everything done longhand. And I thought that was a great hedge against anything going wrong on my active duty career to at least have a master's degree. So
Okay.
Texas A&M was the second one.
Yes, sir. Okay, so now to back up, because you've alluded to a lot of stuff in the breadth of what we talked about here. But so you began your infantry career at Fort Benning, Fort Hood, in Germany. You served in 5th Squadron, 7th Cavalry in Germany, and you served in 3rd Battalion, 42nd Infantry in the 2nd Armored Division.
Yeah, 5-7 Cav was actually at Fort Hood, and then
Okay.
they were redesignated 3rd of the 41st in Germany First commander was Bob Helvey, Distinguished Service Cross in Vietnam. And when I first met him, it was apparent to me that he was none too fond of grads. I don't know why. Maybe he had a bad experience with them. And he said to me, "You ever break faith with me, I'll cut your arm off." And that lesson really, really resonated, that this guy meant business. And over time, we grew extremely close, professionally and personally. I can't say why. Maybe I was not in the mold of what he'd expected, or maybe he had some prior experiences and so forth. I seem to have been haloed by some bias that he might have had. He didn't speak much in that interview in March 1978, except to just, well, let me tell you, if you ever break faith with me, and the rest is history. But great, great commander. And then he took us to Germany. We were redesignated, 3rd of the 41st. Our brigade commander was John Foss. Great, future 4-star. He was our 06 commander too.
Yes, sir.
I learned from some of the best. I really did. Hard men, but great leaders.
Yes, sir. You mentioned that you, ever since Buckner, you wanted to fly the Cobra.
Right, nothing else.
Did you trained on the Huey as well, correct?
Right.
Okay.
In flight school.
But you were able to get the Cobra. Was it a struggle to get the Cobra, or was it if you wanted the Cobra, you could get it?
No, it was proficiency based. But the assignment officers got out in front of the final selection when I was in flight school, because we got our follow-on assignments, and mine was the 25th Infantry Division, 3/4 Cav, Hawaii, with Cobra transition in October of 1979. We just started flight school in July. And I was not your top gun at that point. Let's put it that way. I'd sit in my chair at night and with my eyes closed, rehearse every maneuver, throttle, cyclic, pedals, climbing turn, descending turn, imagine the instruments. I'd chair fly almost every night. And I wasn't doing that. I would go over to the learning center and sit in cockpit mock-ups, and I'd read my manuals. And so we got the assignment that I wanted, which was Hawaii. But then I thought, oh geez, now how will I ever be proficient enough to work my way into the Cobra transition, because the next cut would be at the end of flight school, you know, your grades and your flight proficiency and everything else. But I progressively improved through flight school with a lot of study and in application. And the Cobra transition was really, really hard. Toughest thing I'd done in my life to that point, because we only had 10 hours to the check ride, and had 2 classmates in my Cobra course of 12, and they both flunked it. Both flunked the check ride. And if the flight school check rides are hard, the Cobra transitions were much harder, because it's a heavier platform, much more highly powered. You're armed, and the emergencies are much more unforgiving. When I was in flight school, class of 74 had 2 very prominent graduates crash Cobras and kill themselves. Wow. One in Korea and one in Savannah, Georgia. Very unforgiving aircraft, but you could get it to do anything if you know, you worked at it. The Cobra transition was high demand, high speed maneuvers, and no redos. I mean, it was one and done on the check ride. But passed that check ride with a 79, and I was so grateful to have passed it with a high time German national check pilot, who was a highly decorated special operations pilot, both during Vietnam and subsequent to that. And I remember the day of the check ride. He had a reputation, by the way, too, of being very, very tough. We were all sitting there waiting to see who our assigned check pilots are going to be for check ride day after the end of the first week. Second week was gunnery. The check ride was after 1 week. So you had to master high speed, you know, engine failures, hydraulics off, and so on and so forth. And so we're all checking our shoe shine, wondering who we're going to fly with. And they walk in, the check pilots did, and pretty ceremonious, I might say. And then they scrawled names on the whiteboard, and I saw who I was paired with, and I thought, oh no. And he looked around and said, "Messi, you're with me." And so we went out, did the pre-flight and everything else, and went through all the maneuvers. And the high-speed engine out, hydraulics out were especially tough, because you don't know when the instructor pilot's going to chop the throttle or turn off the hydraulic switch, whether you're on the downwind leg or cross country, and you got to, make your way to the nearest stage field or practice field to do that. But it served me well in Hawaii when I had real hydraulics blow out behind the bulkhead, and splattered cherry juice over the canopy. I had my crew chief in the front, and they shot Maui Airport for me, and I could see the crash trucks lined up on final all the way, and came in about 70, 80 knots indicated, because without a tail rotor, you can't hover. And I was listening to the radio calls as I broke off the rest of my flight. I was a platoon commander at that point, and I kept a wingman with me, and I could hear Honolulu approach control, "Roger, United Heavy, we have an inbound emergency, hold over the Hilo VOR." I thought, oh, somebody else has got an emergency, that's interesting. And then I heard 2, 3 more calls like that, "Roger, hold, Delta Heavy, we have an inbound emergency." And then it finally dawned on me, they're talking about me. And I could see the crash trucks and the beacons turning and everything else, and then finally nosed her over and didn't roll it. I was afraid of not only rolling it, but catching fire, because there was oil all over the fuselage, and the sparks are flying up as the skid tubes burned down completely.
Wow.
The skid tube covers were burned through, but actually burned holes in the skid tubes. I wouldn't want to do that again. It was kind of a rare event, statistically speaking. But the seeds for that were sown on that Cobra check ride, because when the IP, whose name I won't give you, chopped the throttle on the downwind, we're going 130, and I know the hydraulics out is going to come next, and the platform's really vibrating, chops the throttle, and then I got to make that hairpin turn to final, because there's no time to do a base leg at that speed. And I remember in his thickly accented German, he kept saying, "Get the beast on the ground." I won't give you the German, but he was cursing a little bit, "Get the beast on the ground," because it's difficult, to just get it down with very little space to the runway threshold as it was. So I kept hearing his voice, over the Maui Channel as I'm approaching Maui Airport, when I'm having difficulty getting the beast onto the ground. Progressively rolling off throttle, nosing it over, rolling off throttle, nosing it over with no tail rotor control.
Wow.
So had a few more of those too, none quite as severe as that.
Yes, sir. Okay. Now you went to the Armored Advance course, correct?
Yeah, after that I did, that's right.
You did infantry basic, aviation, and armor.
Right.
What was that like for you? Because you're getting a wide variety of experiences.
It was really tough initially, because it was all based on surviving Cold War, and as an interim step National Training Center, which was the graveyard for battalion commanders who didn't do well at NTC. That's before we had the real NTC, Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. But it was very, very difficult, because it was all based on threat identification and recognition, and knowing how to deal with Soviet threat arrays. And typical exams would go something like, at your OP, and you see a PT-76 followed by 2 BRDMs. What part of what formation is that? And I flunked the first exam, despite studying a lot, and I got called in for counseling. Typical, probably a little overconfident going in, high-time Cobra pilot, figured I knew this stuff, got smoked by one of the faculty. Went back, studied hard, did the redo, and I loved CAV doctrine and tactics, 1795, reconnaissance, security, economy of force. And I caught the eye of Gordon Sullivan when he was a 1-star at Fort Knox, and he wanted me to stay behind and teach And talk about kiss of death, being a platform instructor at Benning or Fort Knox. So I didn't want to do that. I dodged that. And then aviation branch says, okay, you're going to come to Fort Rucker to be a Cobra instructor pilot. And now talk about another career ender. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to get back to a troop unit. Okay. So I got to the 82nd by swapping with somebody who wanted to go to Fort Rucker, flew Cobras again, and then commanded my airborne infantry company.
And that was, you were a platoon commander in 1st Squadron, 17th Air Cav.
Yeah.
And then you commanded Echo 504.
Exactly. And Assistant G3 in the middle with Joe Kinzer, lead follower, get out of the way, Macy, he'd say to me, because occasionally there'd be a tough call, and sometimes, naturally, you got to assume the boss is going to want to reserve that right unto himself, but occasionally he'd snap back, lead follower, get out of the way. How many times do I have to tell you that? Mm-hmm. You make the decision. And so that was a valuable 8 months with him. I was one of his assistant G3s.
Yes, sir.
All over the world with him.
Okay.
Quite a guy.
And then in '88 you got your second master's degree, and then your career transitioned and you began a period of working at the highest levels of Department of Defense and in Army personnel. And so from 1988 to 1990, you served as the chief of the mission branch of U.S. Army Recruiting Command at Fort Sheridan, Illinois.
Exactly.
Yes, sir. Tell me about your role in this assignment.
Well, as a newlywed, that was the high point. I had Denise with me for the first time. Okay. And I picked that assignment out of grad school just to be near her at Purdue, where she was doing a fellowship after Texas A&M.
Okay. Before you go on with that, sir, tell me how the two of you met.
At Texas A&M.
Right.
Exactly 10 years to the day from West Point graduation, June the 8th of '87. I was getting ready for my first class, which was an undergrad economics class, because as a military grad student that first summer, they had us take some good, solid undergrad prerequisites. Mm-hmm. Economics, computer programming, and a basic operations research class, mathematical optimization. So I saw her at the blackboard outside this classroom, and she looked to me like she was about 14, and I thought I shouldn't let my imagination run away with me. And then, son of a gun, class starts and she's in that class with me. She walks in and takes her seat, so I figured, well, she's got to be at least 19. That's a good sign. Turns out she was 20. And each day I inched my chair a little bit closer to her to try to meet her. And finally one day, making small talk with somebody next to me, she wheeled around and introduced herself. And thus was born, a good 35 years now together. We've had 2 children. Emily's finishing medical school after a 2-year fellowship at National Institutes of Health after William and Mary. She's at University of Florida now. Okay. A Navy ensign. I saw her the oath at the Iwo Jima Memorial. Her husband's an F-18 pilot, Annapolis grad, class of 15. Our son Robert's at National Cancer Institute now, doing tumor research. He'll start medical school next year, but that's how we met. And wow. It's been a great partnership. So that was the highlight of getting to Fort Sheridan on the lake. Okay. But then the hard part started, because the first thing I had to do was go to the recruiting commanders course just to learn the business, where all new recruiting company commanders would have to go learn the business from top to bottom at Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, now closed. Mm-hmm. And it was all about how to recruit by aptitude category: high school grad, high school high grad, high school grad B, in the middle tier on the AFQT, men, women, seniors, and so on and so forth. And it was learning a whole new language. Mm-hmm. And I struggled with it at the outset because it was literally a whole new language across 10 enlistment categories. I won't bore you with the definitions, but GMA, GSMA, SMA, GMB, GSMB, grad, senior, male, category Bravo, high grad, I'm sorry, high aptitude non-grad, low aptitude non-grad, your Cat 4s, your bottom quartile AFQT, how to recruit them, and where to find them, by market segment. That's what the recruiting commanders course did. And so once there, the instructor said to me, you're going to be the CG's right-hand man. I said, nobody told me anything. He said, yeah, you're going to be the mission branch guy when you actually sign in. And it turns out a 77 classmate had that position, very, very competent, very, very smart. 63 grad, the late Tom Carney, was the CG. Highly decorated, brilliant, brilliant man. And the recruiting command, once the volunteer army really took shape and grew to its current level of effectiveness, was set up by Max Thurman in the model of corporate recruiting. With the technology, he wanted to bring in as many operations research systems analyst officers as he could, so it became a hotbed for FA 49, as it was then known, may still be. So the NCOIC of the recruiting commander's course said to me,
hold on one second, sir. Your microphone slipped down a little bit. Let me get it raised up. There we go. Okay.
Good. That you're going to be his right-hand man. So I finished the recruiting commander's course, not really knowing what I'd learned, and signed in. And the first thing that the PA&E deputy director, program analysis evaluation deputy director, said to me was, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I thought I was going to be the mission branch chief. He said, well, we can try you out there if you want. And I said, might as well. And it was a really, really hard job. I transitioned into it for about 3 months. And what it involved was determining recruiting missions by month for the 55 separate battalions of the recruiting command and 5,000 recruiters based on market dynamics, and specifically some going in mathematical modeling. And we used time series regression, last quarter of production, last 12 months of production, and we develop a projection of what each battalion should be able to do 1 full quarter out. And then those mission numbers, again, all those categories based on headquarters DA accession requirements, boots in the Army, Fort Jackson, Fort Benning, Fort Knox, etc. Those mission numbers we generate would be married up via a queuing program with the training-based requirement. And so we'd iteratively run, these enlistment contract mission scenarios by battalion and by brigade. We had 5 brigades against what the demand required. And we'd see where hits and misses would occur in each month and progressively hand jam the contract mission in the aggregate, then adjust battalion and brigade missions so that we could finally marry up October enlistment missions with June training base requirements. And then once we finally had numbers that would work for each battalion with progressive briefings for the 2 deputy commanding generals and the CG along the way, those would be assigned 90 days out face-to-face to battalion and brigade commanders. And I would fly with the CG. Tom Carney turned over to Jack Wheeler, and those missions would be assigned. But the good part was that you'd have a target on your back 24/7, because the missions that Dave Seary derives in October for January are going to show up as either made or not made, and then Dave has to justify what went right or what went wrong. And so it was an exercise of constantly plowing through the art of the possible, what happened 12 months ago to see what a battalion might be able to do again. And again, it was all framed with good, hard mathematical modeling going in to see if the training-based requirement would be met. And the fellow who took over from Tom Carney was very Thurman-esque in his approach, very exacting, extremely demanding. And nobody wanted to get close to him. He had a bursting radius, so to speak, that was pronounced. And occasionally when I'd get called down to see him or summoned, one of my officers would yell out, "Dead man walking," because sometimes they'd hear the vibrations out in the hallway when he'd explode. And every Saturday, all the low-producing battalion commanders got an all-expense-paid trip to Fort Sheridan to go ahead and justify why they were not making their respective missions for the month. And there was, a pressure, I would say, that I couldn't relinquish, because not only did I have the target on my back, they did too.
Right.
So if I didn't have their numbers right, the price that might have to be paid down the road, forget the Army, I'm talking about the guy sitting across from me who's getting the mission. I was not going to be able to sleep well at night, and there were many nights I didn't sleep well. And back to my knack for memorizing, I had all 55 battalions by category with me in a black bag, like the football that the aide to the president carries. And when I wasn't reading them, I was studying them. And when the boss would ask me, "What's Albany Battalion doing these days?" I'd be able to say, "Well, sir, last quarter they did X, Y, and Z. And this quarter, they've got the mission that we assigned 2 months ago, etc." And I'd be able to call up from memory a good deal of that. I had a folder on each of the 55 battalions, their past and their present missions by category, for example. So that helped a great deal. And I didn't know if I'd survive him, honest to goodness. But, days lead to months, lead to weeks, and I got that question every officer dreams of hearing at various stages of his or her career about 2 years into the job. And he said, "What do you want to do when you leave here?" And I said, "Well, sir, I'm not going to be an infantry battalion commander because I don't have enough infantry time. I never commanded in aviation. But I'll definitely take PhD if the Army will let me." And so it happened. It was tough then. I don't know what the conditions are now to get a spot, but outside of the USMA quotas, Army at large had only 10 PhD positions. There were no bona fide alternate specialties at the time. There were areas of specialization,
right,
but there were no hard-coded new career fields like we've come to have under the new officer personnel management system. And so Army had 10 PhD slots, and they told me all you got to do is get accepted somewhere into a like program, and you're good. So I got into the University of Illinois at Chicago.
In 94?
In 91.
In 91, because you graduated in 94.
91.
Okay.
And started doctoral work in 91. And it was tough. I had to do MBA prerequisites and a lot of coursework first year and begin developing a dissertation idea. Those who'd gone before me told me you need to backplan your dissertation from the time you want to finish. And every single thing you do, every paper you write, every exercise you run ought to be somehow feeding into that dissertation. So that's what I did.
Yes, sir.
And then he gave me the whole recruiting command, really, to study that domain and build my dissertation data set.
Yes, sir. Before we get to that, when you were the chief of mission branch, did you get calls from the battalion commanders saying stuff like, why are you assigning me this mission? And trying to say either I can't do this or I can do more or things like that. Did they call you directly and
brigade commanders? They're brigade commanders. The 5 brigade commanders would, and they'd be very, very heated occasionally. On these mission assignment trips, CG and I would sit across from the battalion and brigade commander say in the month of August for the first quarter mission for the upcoming year. And every one of the battalion commanders in that brigade, say 5th Brigade in San Antonio, would make their entrance, sit across from the CG and across from me. And I had the numbers on a laptop, and they would be shown what their tentative mission was, and the CG would sit next to me, the brigade commander across from him, and the CG would often go to school on the battalion commander on what he or she did not do the last quarter, what the expectations were the upcoming quarter. And these would get tense. These would get very, very tense and heated. They'd be one-way conversations, and then brigade commanders would generally circle back to me and, you know, give me, you know, an earful on everything, you know, that is impeding the effectiveness of these missions, i.e. the numbers are too high, and the standard response would be, you know, we've got to meet the headquarters Department of the Army quality mark. Right. 95% high school diploma graduate, you know, 65% category 1 to 3A, not more than 2% category 4. We do the best we can at segmenting those by battalion based on, you know, your historical production rates. And even in the regression model, we had 4 variables: advertising dollars, enlistment propensity, recruiter share, and market share relative to the other services. And these were the regression variables set in for every single regression equation built for every single battalion. I had a programmer that would actually do the analysis and actually run them without any bias per se. He would just enter the data for the independent variables that were on the shelf, and then he'd hand me the output, and it was up to me to make sense of it. Right. And to work with that, and then occasionally smooth a little. And at the mission assignment conferences, there'd be slack built into every battalion's mission, so the CG could either take some numbers off the top and make the battalion commander feel good about it. In some cases, add mission back in. If somebody was showing a propensity to be able to do more, contractually speaking, the commander might have added some additional mission onto that upcoming quarter.
Yes, sir. What factors were driving the train? Is it more external factors, for example, the economy, you know, global politics, or is it internal factors like the Army needs X number of thousand people to stay at the level that the Army is?
To cut right to it, it would be the latter, because fast forward and a few years later, I'm working these issues on the Army staff. Big Army has its loss projections, which in turn drive the accession projections, both for enlisted and for officers. So that's job one, is to marry up with projected losses what the Army is going to need for replacement. But then geopolitics are going to influence that in itself.
Right. So for example, I'm getting ready to retire. Army knows I'm getting ready to retire.
Right.
So Army knows they need another person to backfill me. But it seems like it might be more tricky to know, all right, X number of soldiers are going to get out mid-career because they're dissatisfied with the Army.
It is very tricky.
So
in 1996, the Army overestimated its enlisted losses by several $1 billion worth, who stayed rather than leaving. The losses did not occur. And so the Army then had to, in 97 and 98, go through a number of very, very difficult personnel budget cutting exercises, cutting officer accessions.
Okay, is this
you may remember that?
The reduction in force, the RIF?
No, this was completely independent of that. Okay. The RIF had already been in progress. You may have heard of a term, change in NCO content. The Army dropped its NCO content from 52 to 48%, CINCOS it was called, to adjust for losses that did not come in on the order of several $1 billion worth. Army had overestimated its losses, so it was all of a sudden faced with too big a force and no way to pay for it. So some very difficult budget cutting adjustments were made. And that was in itself, part and parcel of a strategic miscalculation on my part, because when we stopped SERB and RIF at General Reimer's behest, and I did the analysis for that, actually started the analysis that led to the decision, there was a modest reduction in officer accessions. That was married up after those budget shortfalls with even more officer accession cuts, to include out of USMA, ROTC, and the Army had a hard time making up some company grade shortages in the late 90s, early 2000s, as a direct consequence not only of normal attrition and dissatisfaction with op-tempo, but with accession cohorts that were too small. Mm-hmm. And I had already made adjustments to accession size when we stopped SERB and RIF in 1996. The last Army year group RIF, actually voluntary separation in lieu of RIF, was year group 86. 586 got that call from their assignment officer. You can take the money, half your base pay times twice the length of service each month, or you'll get RIF'd if a RIF board is held. And so when enough VSI takers would decide to take half their base pay, twice the length of service, a RIF would be canceled. One year group was RIF'd, 78, did not have enough people take VSI, and that year group was the only one RIF'd during the drawdown. But SERB was especially painful for lieutenant colonels and colonels. You had battalion commanders coming out of battalion command at 20 years, 2 block, and they're involuntarily retired. Brigade commanders, same thing. So I did the analysis that led to the stoppage of SERB, and the desk for the Army at the time, General Stroop, later chairman of the board, Association of Graduates, had me walking around to the 4-stars who were divided. Some wanted to keep the SERB and RIF in place as a management tool, others wanted it ended, and ultimately the Chief of Staff, Reimer 62, made the decision to stop SERB and RIF in 96.
Okay.
Good decision overall.
Yes, sir. You mentioned projecting a quarter out, correct? But do you have to look farther out than that to try to figure out what numbers might be? And how far out does the Army try to project that?
Nowadays, beginning with the Defense Authorization Bill itself, flowing from national security strategy, national military strategy, those are big numbers that are set years in advance, that are almost immovable. Mm-hmm. And for better or for worse, I had a hand in deriving the 480,000 10 division active force, 355,000 National Guard, 205,000 Army Reserve in 1996, 1997 in a small group. And that number was never suited for 2 wars, but it was immovable. And we couldn't convince people, even when I'm still on active duty and taking the argument into the tank, this will never support Iraq and Afghanistan. I'd be laughed out of the room by some of the SecDef's deputies, because the conventional wisdom, and it turned out to be very prescient, was several 100,000 for 5 to 10 years to occupy Iraq. And I later wrote about it at RAND, wrote an op-ed or 2 about it. Mm-hmm. And I validated those RAND numbers when I was at RAND. General Shinseki had based his analysis not only off of his Bosnia experience, but work that RAND had done when I was still on active duty on what it took to secure Bosnia. So those were good numbers, and what it would take to go ahead and secure both places. And it turns out that Iraq is as dangerous as it's ever been. In Afghanistan, never had enough troops to secure it.
Yes, sir. Okay. All right, and so after earning your PhD in '94, From 94 to 96, you were the Chief of Officer Analysis for the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel in Headquarters Department of Army. What kind of, over your time working in personnel, what sort of issues was the Army facing that moved your calculations up or down?
We were in a period of what I'd look back upon and call peaceful transition. Not exactly holiday from history. Mm-hmm. The issues were chiefly budget and fending off budget cuts. And I described some of what I did vis-a-vis RIF and SERB, but in that officer analysis position, I had responsibility for every single year group of the Army from accession to retirement, what promotion rate individual boards would have, what separation policies would be in effect. For several consecutive years, I wrote the legislation for temporary early retirement authority for majors who were passed over for lieutenant colonel. So we have a lot of outstanding officers who, prior to that period, would have been simply let go with non-selection for lieutenant colonel, but they were given full retirement at 16 or 17, 18 years, whatever their service was. That's typical of the kind of sidebar duties I had, but it was chiefly the year group management. I worked heavily with USMA, with the ROTC commissioning sources, because we covered the landscape. I had only a five-man branch. And every single year group from birth to death really was our responsibility, with an emphasis on the officer life cycle model and numerically what that would involve. And I moved into that job because I'd gotten to know the desk per when I was at the recruiting command, and he would see my work from time to time. One day, the CG called me in and said, once the Gulf War starts, this is 1990 during the bombing campaign, January, we need to figure out when the Army is going to have to ask for draft legislation under a variety of scenarios. So he said, I want you to put it together and don't tell anybody that you're doing it. So at the kitchen table at Fort Sheridan, we had this nice house on the lake where Jonathan Wainwright had lived as a boy, Wainwright of Corregidor.
Yeah,
I have a picture of him standing there on the front doorstep. It's
Wow.
amazing. My wife found this book in Highland Park at a secondhand bookstore, and it was when Fort Sheridan was first built. So that's the Jonathan Wainwright story, Medal of Honor, Corregidor. And at the kitchen table, I used a variety of open sources, the news, Center for Army Analysis, then known as Concepts Analysis Agency, CAA, and I built 4 scenarios from short war to very long war out to years. And then I built, I'd call it a timetable, on when high quality recruiting would run out under the long war scenarios, and then when recruiting period would run out. So CG sent me to Washington to brief this to the 2-star assistant desk per, who would later become my boss in desk per. And he said, where'd you get the scenarios? I said, I developed them. And he said, this has got to be secret. So he called for the stamp, stamped it all secret, put the cover sheet on it, sent it to the Chief of Staff of the Army, Vono. And so we had in place a plan to go ahead and request draft legislation under a long Gulf War scenario, 6 months to a year, maybe longer than that, because the outcomes were unclear. Mm-hmm. You know, what form it would take, whether the Republican Guard, the vaunted Republican Guard would fight and be effective, and so on and so forth. But that was typical of some of the global kind of work that would get done. And then when I finished my doctorate, I learned that I was on assignment to desk per, where he was going to become the desk per, that same 2-star that I had briefed on this work.
Yes, sir. And when you said you managed like officer year groups, that must be what, 30 plus years of officers? Because,
yes.
Wow.
Exactly.
That's a lot of.
Well, one of the
tools. A lot of management.
One of the tools was a survival curve.
Right.
where each group is and where their ideal curve would be based on a good, solid, enduring loss rate. You start at 1.0 for, say, year group, whatever it was. And there was one year group that had an ideal pattern before RIF and SERB had started. Maybe it was 72 or 68 or something like that. And you start at 1.0, see how many are there at the end of year one, multiply the outcome, and you have probabilities and you have outcomes, probabilities and outcomes. And then that becomes the ideal survival curve.
Right.
And then during the RIF, when that was on, you'd look at what year groups were way, way above the ideal curve. And those year groups would be, you know, the first focus. Now that was right before I went into the job, when the survival curve was used to go ahead and lop off halves of, well, not halves, but maybe, you know, 10 or 20% of a year group. With my doctorate freshly printed, I came in and studied the problem, and I said, I'm not sure that there's enough rationale to continue this right now. It was institutionalized. There were a lot of senior officers that wanted to keep it because it enabled, you know, the institution to wield a very, very powerful incentive, you know, over its officers. But I said to General Stroop, I just don't see the rationale for it right now. I said, I'd like to study it some more, because that wasn't out of the blue. I had just gotten the mission on my assignment there to develop the SERB and RIF numbers for FY 97. And when I went in, for 96, when I went in, the 95 RIF and SERB boards were already underway, and year group 86 didn't need to have a RIF because enough took the voluntary separation incentive. Right. But I was to start on the 96 numbers, and I just wasn't seeing it. I mean, there were some blips, you know, with bars above the ideal curve, but not sufficient to keep the institution going on that track. Well, I had an 06 boss who was vehemently opposed to stopping SERB. He was an AG officer, and his boss was an AG officer. And so we got our wires crossed a lot. I didn't know if I'd survive that assignment. But, you know, I called it like I saw it, and I didn't see enough rationale to keep it.
Yes, sir. And
occasionally we'd be at real loggerheads, like make the numbers work. And I can't do that. I'm just not seeing it.
Yes, sir.
You get the picture.
Yes, sir. I'm getting the picture that there's a lot of math for somebody who didn't like math in college.
That's true too. And I didn't sleep very much, and we had our first baby in '94. Okay. And I took on my first adjunct teaching job because
yes, sir.
I didn't know when the clock would run out on my my military career. So I learned how to do without sleep. I did, and we had both our children between '94 and '99, but it was fun. I mean, I couldn't put them down. Yes, at night, and I'd give my wife a break.
Okay. Now, from 96 to 98, you were a strategic planner for the Chief of Staff of the Army, Dennis Reimer.
Right.
Correct? And what were the major issues or major concerns in that job?
The long view, and building the right kind of force and making the right kinds of trade-offs between manpower, modernization, training, and actual deployments. And there were relatively few at that time compared to what the Army's done. And in that capacity, we'd take the larger strategies, national security strategy, national military strategy, and work down to what the Army might look like in the out years. There's a lot of out year planning. I was officially with program analysis and evaluation. And then one day, General Reimer's XO tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're coming with me." And I didn't know who he was. I'd seen him by sight, very nondescript looking fellow. And we went to an adjoining office, and he said, you know, the quadrennial defense review was about to start. And that was a cross-cutting across the whole Army staff and major command activity headed by a 3-star to respond to Defense Secretary initiatives on future forces. And so this fellow, who was General Reimer's XO, said, we're going to work out from under the Quadrennial Defense Review in a small group because Chief of Staff wants some alternative looks at the problem. And so 6 of us were in civilian clothes for 6 months in leased office space down the road from the Pentagon, working alternative force structures and budgets. And first day, this fellow, Jim Dubik, retired 3-star eventually. Quite a scholar, by the way, former Jesuit, PhD, said, how do we attack the problem? Here's the chief's going in guidance. I want you to look at alternative force structures based on alternative budgets. We knew that some major modernization changes were going to require some significant adjustments to the manpower accounts. It was trading manpower for modernization. And Chief wanted to preserve 10 divisions. And so I built a matrix of options, and I still have it because Jim Dubik printed off the whiteboard. And down the vertical axis in handwritten sprawl, we have the budget cuts. 2 billion, 4 billion, 6 billion, 8 billion. At the time, the Army budget was about 60 billion. Mm-hmm. And across the top, we have force sizes for active component and reserve component down to brigade level of detail. At the time, the Army was 510,000 and active component. And so for each budget cut, we'd have a new array of the force. Well, that was after a week we arrived on that. For the next several months, we'd fill in the blanks. And each week, he and I would go sit down with the Chief of Staff at his little round conference table, and he'd pore over the numbers. And he was very, very exacting. Tell me about this, tell me about that. You know, how many brigades, how much are we overstructured at this point to be able to support this level of manpower. Budget cuts on the y-axis, force sizes on the x-axis for each budget. And so on the 2 billion line, came up with 480,000 active component, 355,000 National Guard, 205,000 U.S. Army Reserve, down to the division brigade level of detail. And when the final budget cut was announced by SecDef Cohen, it was Army 2 billion, from manpower to modernization. All the services had various adjustments made, but the Army's had the biggest one. So we had 480K on the shelf, carefully advertised as supporting 10 divisions to 90% strength, sufficient for one major war and nothing else. Mm-hmm. A lesson that fell on deaf ears, no matter how many times we tried to convey it. In fact, till 9/11, the Army was supposed to lose 2 more divisions, down to 8. And I was in the Chief's office around September the 9th, talking about plans. I was a division chief at that point, and in 06, talking about plans to take the Army to 10 divisions, I'm sorry, to 8 divisions from 10, and where that money was going to go ostensibly. And it was going to go to the Air Force, precision strike, and the Air Force was going to school on the Army budget. But 9/11 changed everything.
Okay.
That was QDR, I think, number 2.
Okay. All right, sir. So to jump forward then, in 98 you returned to the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, where you became the Deputy Director for Plans and Resources,
yes,
which you just said. You earned your 3rd master's degree at the Army War College in 99, and you returned to the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, where you served as the Plans Division Chief until 2002.
Right.
And this is a period of major change for the Army, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
So you just talked about the situation in the Pentagon prior to September 11, 2001, and some of your key concerns with size and force structure and everything. What happened on September 11th, 2001 in your situation?
Well, operationally speaking, or on a ground floor level.
Start with your personal experiences,
Yeah.
and then we can go into what changed operationally.
Great. Well, I was a young 06, frocked early in '99, and when I was selected for the War College, I knew the handwriting was on the wall, that I really had a shot at this. That was when the competition was battalion commanders. There were no allocations for nuclear engineers or force managers. My competition was, the infantry battalion commander for 06. So it was probably the high point of my professional life, and went in early in '99, and had a great year and a half there, and it was an exercise in managing the Army's force structure. I had a field grade officer assigned for every branch of the Army, and he answered directly to every two-star commandant, the infantry commandant, the armor commandant, the artillery commandant. And so every day I worked force structure issues, more machine gunners for the infantry, more M1 tank crews for the armor. And sometimes I'd work them directly with the two-star commandant via, my assigned field grade who represented that branch. And so what we did was looked at the manpower implications up against the DES Ops, now G3 generated pure force structure options. And it was an exercise in faces versus spaces. Mm-hmm. What the Army could supply versus what the Army absolutely needed. My counterpart was a new one-star by the name of Ray Odierno, now deceased, later Chief of Staff of the Army. And these were very, very competitive exercises, for scarce resources, what the Army had to have versus what the Army could supply. Whereas in prior assignments, recruiting command or officer division, I worked the enlistment procurement model, the officer year group exercises. Now in this case, we're actually working it by branch. Tank crews, gun crews, aviation crews, and so forth. Chiefly the active duty component, the component that's already there. What DES Ops sees and maybe what else it wants versus what kind of movement we have to create in the force to get that done. How close can we come to the actual manpower requirement? And so it was a fairly routine, way of life for us there. I mean, it fit me like a glove because I already had years of incumbency on the Army staff. And one position begot another. And one major exercise that I ran for the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, Jack Keane, was the officer shortage. Part of which, like I said, was created by under-assessing year groups when we stopped to serve. Part of it created by budget shortfalls. But an exercise like that would have run for months of iterations back and forth to see him. And so we were getting ready for another QDR in September of '01, and like I said, I'd seen the Chief of Staff of the Army on the 9th subject, the possible 8 division force. And on the 11th, I had just dropped our daughter at school in Annandale, nice little Catholic school, St. Ambrose, where her brother later went to. And I got in to the Pentagon right after the first plane had hit New York. And Yeah, immediately the alarm bells went off, figuratively speaking. People were gathered watching TVs.
Had you heard that on the radio coming in, or
I was in the parking lot walking in when it evidently just happened. When I walked in, some of my officers, rushed me and said, "Colonel MASI, did you hear what happened?" I said, "What happened?" And because the school was only about 10 minutes away from the Pentagon, I might have heard, snippets of it, I don't recall. But the picture really became clear in there. And it's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we're gathered in my boss's office. He was a senior 06, near retirement, but in a 2-star billet. And desk personnel G1 was divided into two-star directorates. And so we were in his office, a number of us were, when the second plane hit. We thought it was a replay of the first plane. We're watching it on TV, and Peter Jennings, called it live, literally. And we figure something bad is really going to happen. It's all around us now, and you don't know what's next. This can't be coincidence. And one of our officers said, "Sir, what kind of defenses do we have on top of the Pentagon?" I said, "You see the snipers when the president comes and goes, that's it. I mean, there's no air defense, there's nothing to interdict anything." I'd been the acting director in that directorate for the prior 2 weeks because my boss was on TDY. And he liked to have his finger on every button. He'd call me several times a day while he was gone, typically. And while we're in the office there, he said to me, this is about 9:15 now, "Ralph, let's go see the boss. We got to catch up." I said, "This is a hell of a time to catch up." I said, "I've caught you up on everything." He said, "No, we need to sit down with him." And I'm thinking, "Oh, this doesn't sound right." And so he got us on the calendar to go see General Maude for 9:30. And his meeting ran late with Gary Smith, a retirement services, and a contractor from Booz Allen on a new retirement services web-based tool. And at 9:37, American Airlines 77 hit the Pentagon. And to me, it sounded like an enormous truck bomb. I thought it was maybe a tractor trailer filled with explosives. A replay of 1993, when the lead plotter said, "Not yet, we didn't get you this time, but will the next time." And it was an enormous inside-out roar. And what I didn't know was that was a 757, Flight 77, knifing through concrete and steel, 120 feet long, and the nose cone penetrated all the way to 150 feet beyond where we were, but that was on the ground floor. We're on the second floor, but the ceiling caved, the walls heaved, and chunks broke loose, and everything filled with smoke very, very quickly. And we began the evacuation, and the fire doors slammed shut, got all our people out, got several out right under the fire doors as they were coming down from the various corridors. And we were in the C ring, 2 rings away from the impact, 5 concentric rings at the E ring, and about 120 feet from the actual point of impact.
Wow.
And what had happened was it clipped the light poles on Highway 27 and pancaked in. It hit the dirt first. So instead of 200 killed, there'd have probably been 5,000 killed, because the intent was to ram straight through at the midpoint of the concrete structure of the Pentagon. The next day, as a senior survivor, the FBI took me out everywhere I wanted to go. And I saw some pretty grim sights, but right out to the light poles. And I saw where Flight 77 had clipped the light poles, and it sheared off part of its wing and skidded in. So that's what slowed the impact and minimized the fatalities from what would have been probably 2,000 down to, I believe it was 189, counting the flight crew. And after we evacuated everybody, I went in one last time, and it was eerie quiet. but I could still hear the vestiges of fire, some occasional low popping sounds. I didn't know if those are smaller secondary explosions, maybe personal devices that were in there. Mm-hmm. And for a moment, I remember my knees feeling like I was in the batter's box, facing somebody thrown in the 90s, because I'm thinking maybe this is how it ends. But I wanted to make sure that there was nothing within our neighborhood, so to speak, and that every single person was out. We had 25 killed, all around us of the 189, about 50-50 military and civilian, and then began 24 hours of just accounting for each other. We were completely scattered, who was alive, who was where. And then we had the wartime mission of reconstituting and getting ready for the next steps, and also rebuilding. And as one of two senior survivors, we had to bury our dead all the way to December. And so we had to do a lot of family planning as well. And my wife found herself as one of those, with surviving spouses and children, and we assigned officer wives to the role of family caregiving too, that went all the way into the next year. In fact, they did a heroic job. So that's how that day went. And then in conjunction with getting our wartime footing and reconstituting for our everyday mission, the war drums for Iraq began to sound, and the Pentagon was still burning when President George H.W. Bush was first lobbied hard to go to war with Iraq, that this had to be Iraq's doing, and a lot of people knew better and were very skeptical, to say the least, going in.
Okay. On a personal note, on September 11th, how were you able to communicate with your wife and tell her you were okay?
Not very easily. Not very easily at all.
Sure.
By the time we were out of there, let's see, I think it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. No, everything was dead. There were no cell phones, no nothing. Her bosses had already come to her and said, maybe this is all over now. And she fully expected it, till I made contact with her, and everybody was relieved. And Robert was too young to know, but Emily certainly knew what had happened, because they locked them down on school and in school rather, and brought them to shelter. And by the way, General Maude and everybody in his outer office was killed on impact. Mm-hmm. Many right there, in that line of attack, all the way through to the center courtyard practically.
Right. Wow. Okay. And so, so now you mentioned the war drum sounding in the Pentagon, and you had already said, the Army strength is not adequate for the missions that are now coming. And so, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, very quickly, by fall of 2001, we went from Army get ready to drop 2 divisions for Air Force precision strike under QDR 01. The first QDR I did was 96. We went from Army get ready to go to 8 divisions to Army get ready for war with Iraq. And oh, by the way, we'd already launched the attack to successfully take down the Taliban. Mm-hmm. But with insufficient force, following that, bin Laden escapes, Taliban reconstitutes with little help from Pakistan. We never had sufficient force to go ahead and win decisively in Afghanistan, let alone to do Iraq. Too small a size force going in, no cav regiments in itself that helped give rise to the insurgency, couldn't secure the flanks in the rear areas. Mm. And that force was to have been used again in the minds of some of the ideologues that had been brought into government against Syria or Iran. Fast forward to 2003, and I'm back to the War College for the first time, this time as a senior RAND analyst and study director, and it's the annual strategy conference. And one of the Iraq War senior planners, intellectual architects, was the guest speaker, the keynote speaker. And it was a day, ironically, that Saddam's statue had fallen. Talk about timing.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave up, time on his schedule to brief at the War College, declare victory, great day for the Iraqi people. And came time for Q&A. And I later wrote about this in a 2013 op-ed on the 10-year anniversary of Colin Powell's UN speech.
Mm-hmm.
But the Q&A continued, and I asked a loaded question of him in front of all my peers and colleagues, all War College people, officers and so forth. And they're cheering him and everything that he said. And I said, 2 words, what's next? And with a real smirk, he said, Iran or Syria, take your pick. And I said, I don't think so. We haven't even begun to think about the known unknowns, let alone the unknown unknowns. And it was the most well-received crescendo of catcalls and hisses I've ever gotten in my life. I loved hearing it because I knew what crowd I was playing to. I was telling my active duty and senior retired audience that it wasn't going to go the way that it was foreseen. I was a devotee of the several 100,000 for 5 to 10 years. And people on the inside absolutely knew it, based on the remnants of the Republican Guard and how they would wage the insurgency. And people on the inside also knew that there was a low probability of finding any significant WMD. In fact, another intellectual architect of the war had said it was the only thing we could all agree on, that there was a possibility. That was after the fact. He also said to Tom Ricks, the author, who I know, we never thought we'd get a ground war till 9/11. And most of these planners were with Project for a New American Century, as it was known. They came into office when the government was put together rather hastily after the Florida recount was stopped by the Supreme Court in January 2001. And at the top of the list for Project for a New American Century was removing Saddam Hussein from power. So, back to we never thought we'd get a ground war till 9/11. For the ideologues that came into government, it was a dream come true until the bill came due. And we're still paying for it. And of course, a lot of that thinking helped give rise to the idea for our class of 1977 50th gift, named for Ambassador Michael A. Sheehan. It's the class of 1977 Ambassador Michael A. Sheehan Distinguished Chair in Strategy at West Point, to educate on strategy making at all levels, what it takes to go to war and win, and to secure the peace. Now, Mike Sheehan had called the terrorist attack on the Pentagon because he was one of the first to call attention to Osama bin Laden. I'd been out of touch with Sheehan for 25 years, since the basic course, and we resumed contact when I'm in retirement out of active duty, and he has left government, although he'd go back into government one more time. But around the time that he called 9/11 aircraft hitting the Pentagon, I had told colleagues that the attack would probably come from the air one day when they're putting in the concrete barriers outside the Pentagon. There was enough chatter already at that point to suspect the use of hijacked airliners. And this is around the year 2000. And I said the attack will come from there. We're outside after doing our PT. And so Sheehan, who had called it, was subsequently UN ambassador, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Assistant Secretary of State. And this class of 77 gift to educate on strategy at all levels, from cadets to senior policymakers, is a hedge against making sure that strategic miscalculations don't get made with the price paid in blood. American history is replete with tactical heroism and success and strategic failure, to include World War II. I mean, you look at the strategic value of the Philippines or Iwo Jima, none. Hardly ever used for fighter escorts. B-29s didn't need it for emergency landings. 7,000 Marines, Army, and sailors killed. You look at the European theater and the broad front strategy, which slowed down the force when Patton could have annihilated the remnants of the German army at the Falaise Gap. And the escape enabled the Battle of the Bulge, 100,000 more casualties in 1945. We got grand strategy right in World War II, win in each theater, but within the theaters there were definite problems. And with one notable exception, the 1990-91 Gulf War, strategic failure has been a hallmark of American national security. So this gift educates, like I said, at all levels. It's a gift for all services, retired 4-star, somebody of ambassadorial rank, to go in there and do that 3 or 4 year appointment with the class of 77, actually have a say in the selection, besides the commandant and the superintendent, to make sure we get the right person in there. And the chair will go in 2027. Fundraising starts very soon, and it was voted overwhelmingly by the class of 77. So, it had in its origins, some of the things that I described out of 9/11, because the hazards unfolding were so apparent to the most casual observer, and there was a lot of groupthink. Even the mainstream media was reluctant to really put the plan through some critical thinking rigor, and that's a hallmark of this distinguished chair in strategy, sponsored by the class of 77, on into perpetuity. Mm-hmm. Critical thinking rigor imposed on national security decisions. The war colleges do it at the individual level, but it's not systematic. Nobody getting that war college education and strategy wants to look to his left and look to his right and say, I'm one of those guys that's not going to make BG. They learn to play along, and as colonels, as 1 and 2 stars, what are they going to do? Underneath senior policymakers and that quote-unquote thin layer of civilian control, as Secretary Rumsfeld termed it. Well, there was a thin layer of a lot of civilian incompetence that got us where we ended up, for the first decade, with another 7,000 dead. Talked about Iwo Jima, 7,000 there, 7,000 between Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm not sure we're any farther along than we were when we started those 2 exercises. Certainly look at Afghanistan and the Taliban back in power. But that's what the Distinguished Chair in Strategy does. And because that's somebody who's no longer in government, he can walk into the SecDef's office, or for that matter, the Oval Office, like Jack Keane did, retired 4-star, when he had 30 minutes with Bush to justify the surge in Iraq, and make the case for doing something or not doing something. That's what this position does, besides the education level at the military academy itself, the elective classes, and planting those seeds early. The chairholder educates strategy at all levels of the strategy making domain.
Yeah. Yes, sir. That sounds like a fabulous gift to the academy and to the nation.
Yeah, I think it will be. It's West Point, armed services, and nation, and that's how it was conceived. And with respect to the West Point angle, it takes us back to why West Point was conceived. And in the words of one notable graduate, 1962, your purpose remains fixed, firm, inviolable. It is to win our wars. And that was Douglas MacArthur in his Thayer speech. And I think that's another reason the class identifies with it. Great class. And it harkens back to the very reasons we chose West Point, or it chose us, back in 1972.
Yes, sir. Wonderful. So you retired from the Army in 2002.
Yes.
And you continued a career as a college professor that started back in '95 when you became adjunct faculty at Marymount University. In 2002, you began teaching at the University of Maryland in their School of Business. And you've continued a lifetime of education, right, and continuing education. Tell me a little bit about your service in college.
Well, I teach strategy and leadership, fittingly, I hope, and it's kept my head in the game with the University of Maryland, and I transitioned from Marymount to Maryland in 2002, the same time that I started full-time at Rand.
Right, and Rand was 2002 to 2012.
Yeah, 2002 to 2012. In 2010, Maryland offered me a 9-month appointment, which I did simultaneously the last 2 years at Rand, and in 2012 offered me full-time 12-month appointment. So I took that and then reverted to adjunct when I was 62 in 2017, which is what I do now. Basically a half-time 9-month appointment, and I teach 9 months a year, September to June. But whereas the focus is corporate strategy, and specifically the execution school of strategy, I like to term it, out of the Harvard Business School, ends, ways, and means. The War College has adopted that as its model for teaching strategy: objectives, concepts, and resources. The last one to really get it right in that respect was Colin Powell in the first Gulf War, but he was overruled going into Iraq, not in the defense chain any longer, rather as the Secretary of State. But objectives, concepts, and resources. What'll it take to fight? What'll it take to resource it? And then how are you going to go ahead and get to those objectives, both geographically speaking and geopolitically speaking? It's a big, big job. Yes. And it's not something for amateurs who come and go every 3 or 4 years or every 2 or 3 years from high political office, but it's for seasoned and reasoned professionals who also have the gravitas and the reputation to be able to pick up the phone and talk to somebody and say, here's what you really haven't thought about, here's what you need to really think through, we need to talk. And DOD and the White House absolutely welcome ventures like this. So does West Point, as a matter of fact. It also puts West Point very much in the game. I mean, it was conceived in 1802 by Jefferson and his successors as the crown jewel of America's defense, and it ought to be, and it will continue to be. And all of the centers of excellence at West Point, go a long way towards reinforcing that.
Yes, sir. You've talked quite a bit about the importance of your class to you, and you remain active with your class in a lot of different ways.
I do.
Which is outstanding. A couple final questions for you, sir. What does your service mean to you?
Oh, it means everything. Whenever I get that thanks for your service, which I must project because I don't wear any regalia, I feel almost sort of embarrassed. Mm-hmm. My reflexive reaction is it was a privilege, truly a privilege to be able to serve. I never took it for granted. I took it as an honor, to be able to start it and to be able to complete it. So in a word, it means everything. Mm-hmm. Right up there with family, faith, and all that we hold dear.
Yes, sir. And Final question for you, sir. What does West Point mean to you?
Again, it's a crown jewel of the whole American defense experience. It's what it was conceived to be. It's what it must be going forward. And, you know, West Point in the superintendency used to be a stepping stone to the position of Army Chief of Staff. Mm-hmm. There are 5 former Chiefs of Staff that were West Point superintendents. It was considered that important, and still is. And this gift, you know, does a little something on behalf of the class to reinforce that rock solid purpose of West Point.
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm so glad you came in to share your story with us today.
It's been my privilege, Dave.
It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
Yes, sir.